All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We have a pretty full program, so we don't want to delay. And I appreciate everybody spending the night with us. We've got I think, some really cool stuff. We have 5 animals that we've already have harvested that came out of various feed yards. We took them over to our Rosenthal Meat Science and Technology Center, and they were videotaped live, and then we videotaped them as carcasses, and we'll show you the boxed beef that came from those animals. And so we'll have a pretty full story to tell you about those particular 5 animals. I want to start off the program by turning it over to Jason Bagley. Jason is a vice president of the Texas Beef Council, and as such, he works with all the beef producers. He is in charge of beef resources and beef education and producer education. And he has been with us through many, many years of Beef 706s since they started back in 1993 was the first official Beef 706 that we have. So Jason, why don't you take it from there?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you all for being here. My name is Jason Bagley, not to be confused with Dr. Jason Cleere that's going to be speaking next. But I am with the Texas Beef Council. So that's the beef checkoff here in Texas. And I am really excited to welcome you here and kick off this virtual Beef 706. As Dr. Hale said, this program has been around since 1993. It's been around for a long time, and it's been a partnership between Texas A&M University, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and the Texas Beef Council for a long time. And we're excited to, I think, have the first virtual Beef 706. I can't say that I saw this coming until a few months ago. But I guess before we get started, I want to take a quick look back about how this program how it came to be and where it really started. So every 5 years, the Beef Checkoff conducts a research project called the National Beef Quality Audit. And it started back in the early 90s. And what this project does is it serves as a benchmark for the cattle industry. It looks at a broad spectrum of data points from carcass quality and yield grading to bruising and injection site lesions, condemnations of carcasses, things that are caused by management practices. It really looks at a lot of different things, and it identifies some of the quality shortfalls and then how the industry can positively affect quality with ultimately the goal to increase consumer demand for beef. So you're going to hear the word quality defined different ways over the next couple days. And the way I think of it, to me, quality, as I'm going to talk about it tonight, is that tender, juicy, nutritious, safe product that a consumer wants to buy. And to me, that's the key to beef demand. You know, from a checkoff perspective, that's the world that I live in, and it's all about beef demand. You know, at the end of the day, the consumer is the one that has to pull their wallet out of their pocket, and they've got to buy our product. So whether you're in the purebred business or commercial cow-calf or stocker, feeder, you know, packer, retailer, food service, it doesn't matter. We all rely on that consumer to choose beef to keep us going. And we have a really complex industry. And I think what's great about this Beef 706 program is that it puts you in the boots of the other industry segments, unfortunately just figuratively, because we're not going to put anybody in rubber boots and let you cut a carcass this time since it's virtual, but it puts you in the boots of other industry segments and helps you understand what happens after those cattle leave the ranch. One of the things that I think is important to remember is that no matter what segment you're in or how far removed you are from that consumer, you have a hand in creating a quality product that's going to be on someone's plate someday. And that's everything you do, from your day-to-day management decisions, whether that's branding, weaning, handling, herd health, all those things impact the quality and the safety of the product when it gets to the consumer. The more that we know about how to positively impact the quality and safety, the better off we're going to be able to meet that consumer's expectations and increase their demand for beef product. This program is normally a 2-day, kind of roughly 18 hours of education. It's a really long first day and then half of a second day. And what they're going to do over the next 3 nights in 2-hour increments is try and summarize all that. And they're going to talk about market steer value. They're going to talk about carcass value and box beef value, and then really bring it back to what's important at the ranch level, you know, from a genetic standpoint, from a calf management standpoint, and really boil it down to what are the most important things you can do as a rancher to add value. And it's going to be like drinking from a fire hose, I think. But I'm really excited about this opportunity to bring this virtual program to so many folks. You know, for everyone, this has been a strange year, to say the least. This pandemic has completely changed how we define normal everyday life. Who would have thought we'd be doing this virtually, first of all? But we're certainly missing the in-person interaction, and not only at this Beef 706 meeting, but also at all the different type of events we do, from consumer events to nutrition and health influencer events where we're promoting beef. We're missing all that, but our goal hasn't changed. We're still trying to grow beef demand, and we're just trying to do it in different ways. And I really wish that I could spend an hour or two, you know, giving you a snapshot of all the different things we have continued to do, even through, you know, the last 4, 5, 6 months through this pandemic, and how we're still able to work every day to keep beef top of mind for consumers. I'll tell you that 10 to 15 years ago, it would have looked a lot different. Back then, we didn't have the streamlined ways to reach consumers through digital and social media platforms. You know, our goal has always been to reach that consumer with a beef message, but we've really been able to take that next step in recent years and target the right consumer with the right message at the right time, and on a digital platform where they are. And it's really allowed us to be more nimble in our marketing campaign and continue to reach consumers even during all this pandemic. The unfortunate side of that is, working in that digital space, we have become very specific about who, how, and when we reach folks. And unfortunately, most producers, a lot of producers, don't meet that target audience of that kind of 20 to 40 something year old millennial parent, you know, with a young family. And so that's a double-edged sword, because, you know, you're not going to see the messages. But I'll be honest with you, I don't want to waste your money convincing you to eat beef. I know you already eat it. You know, ideally, I would like to reach that 20 to 40-year-old consumer in San Antonio, in Austin, in Dallas, in Houston, in those urban areas where they have no idea how cattle are raised. That's who I want to reach. And I want to do it when they're looking for a meal to put on the table for their family. And that's who I want to see and to hear the beef messages. I want them to see it when they're on Instagram and they're looking for a food picture as a meal inspiration. I want them to find the Beef Loving Texans website, and I want them to find us on Instagram. You know, when they're online looking for recipes to cook for that night, and maybe they're looking for ground beef, I want them to find Beef Loving Texans and Beef It's What's for Dinner recipes. To me, that's a win. So I would encourage you to go to the website, texasbeefcheckoff.com, and sign up for Cattle Talk. I'm going to post the link in the chat box so you can click on it and go directly there. Please don't do it while Jason Cleere is talking. But if you'll go there, that is a monthly e-newsletter that comes out each month, as well as a printed version every other month if you still want to hold it in your hand. And this will help keep you up to date on how your checkoff dollars are being invested to grow demand, because that's a really important thing. So, as I mentioned earlier, you know, Texas Beef Council and the Checkoff, we've been committed to this Beef 706 sponsorship for many years. You know, we do that because our board of directors, which is made up from across the state, truly sees value in it. And I hope that when we finish up tonight and the next few nights, you will too. From a checkoff, we can focus on doing research in the area of safety and quality, sustainability, nutrition. You know, we can reach consumers with beef messages and beef recipes and cooking information, and we can do trainings for retailers and food service operators on how to best utilize beef. We can even take it a step further, and we can go into medical offices and discuss the positive attributes of beef in a high cholesterol diet, and encourage doctors to change their recommendations to actually have patients include beef in their diet. And we can do all those things, but unless we start at the beginning and spend some time focusing on creating a safe product, none of this other stuff matters. It starts at the ranch. It starts with what you do every day and how your product will become food on someone's plate at some point in the future. And that product may be a calf, it may be a cow, it may be a bull, but that is your product that you sell, and it'll be on someone's plate at some point. So thank you for this opportunity to kick things off tonight. I know this is going to be a wonderful program. I've taken part in these in person for many years now, and I still learn something every time I sit through it. I hope that you do too. And I hope I've set the stage for kind of what's to come over the next 3 days and why it is so important. Thank you to AgriLife Extension for putting this program together. And thank you, Dr. Hale and Dr. Cleere for being here tonight and making this program a reality. With that, Dr. Hale, I will turn it back over to you.
All right. Hey, great.
Hey, Dan, I've got a couple of comments.
Good.
Hey, on the, just a couple of things that came in on the chat while Bagley was talking. And one of them was, will this apply to small herd producers or just big ranchers? And also, will it, apply to, essentially the, those selling local beef? And the answer is yes. I mean, the things we'll talk about the next 3 nights are for both small and large producers. It's just different scales. The reality is we're all in the food business, and we're producing beef, whether it's selling it from a large commodity or a branded beef program, or if you're selling an animal that you're going to sell to somebody and they're going to process it themselves. I mean, we've got to make sure we ensure the safety and the quality of that product so they're willing to pay those premium prices. So yeah, I just want to interject that. That was some questions that were thrown up in the chat before we get started.
Yeah, if you haven't noticed, there is a chat button down there. So click on that. You can type questions in that. This is Jason Cleere, who's beef cattle specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Been in that many years. He is, one of our top experts on beef cattle production. I'm so glad he's with me tonight. And we'll see many of those others that will talk about genetics, talk about feeder calves, and talk about kind of the most important things to ranchers. And I think those messages will apply whether big or small. And also it's going to give you a much bigger idea, or maybe a better idea of what happens with your cattle after they leave your ranch. That's one of our goals, is to help you see more value as it goes from a calf off a ranch through the feed yard. And particularly in this particular training, more talking about what happens when it gets to the packer and goes on from there. But we will be, particularly on the 3rd night, talking specifically to ranchers about what they can do to apply best management practices in their operations. I did see a question about the viewability of this. And we will be sending out a link to a recording for anybody that has registered. So if you've registered, you'll get that link. You'll be able to view that for about 2 weeks, week to 2 weeks, and then that will be, this will be moved over to our Ag Learn sites, and we'll be making it where you have to register again to view it after that. So it will be available, but only on a temporary basis as we go through. So again, thank you for being here tonight. And you might notice that Jason did put in the chat box a link to the website that he had talked about. All right, let's get started. We're going to talk about tonight what impacts the value of cattle in the cattle industry. So we're going to start off. So first of all, I do want to thank the Texas Beef Council. You all can see my screen, is that right? Jason, Sharon, okay?
Yes, you're good, Dan.
All right, thanks. So Texas Beef Council has been sponsoring this since 1993. And right now you'd be in a group of about 40 cattle producers sitting generally over in Rosenthal Meat Science and Technology Center. We would look at these cattle. We would then watch the harvest process. We do grading, and we would suit you up in white frocks and hard hats and safety equipment and have you cut up a side of beef. That's what we generally do. And then we finish up doing the beef cattle management talks at the end of this as we go through. And so the Texas Beef Council has been with us from the very beginning. So thank you very much for sponsoring this course and providing it so all these wonderful people can see it at no cost. So thank you very much, Jason, and to the Texas Beef Council. And of course, most everyone you're going to see in this This, as far as speakers, are from the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and our goal is to make people and help them in their daily lives, help their livelihoods. And our goal here is to make you more profitable and to improve the beef quality of the products that we produce as an industry. So here's 3 head. I want to thank Graham Land and Cattle Company. They, Maurice Jonda, who is the plant manager down at Gonzales, selected these 3 animals for us. I kind of gave him a hit list, and he went and picked them out and shipped them up here for us to look at. So these are 3 steers. We'll see about a 1.5-minute video of each one of these steers before the night's over, and we're going to ask you to make estimates on those steers. So we have these 3 beef animals, and these cattle, just to kind of give you an idea, a little bit about the history of those animals. The red one is from actually Lake Charles, Louisiana. He was on feed 276 days. In weight was about 508 pounds, was given a Synovex choice implant, and then followed by a Revelar 200 implant. And so then the 2 Angus cross cattle, or Angus type of cattle, they were purchased out of Hamilton, Texas, and they were preconditioned, put on feed 211 days, and also given a Synovex choice implant, and then a Revelar 200 implant. So appreciate them doing it. In addition to that, we've added some exciting things. We brought a Holstein into this program. Now, we don't usually always have Holsteins in here, but we knew we had a wide, very diverse audience that might either be feeding Holsteins, or maybe some dairy producers here that are raising Holstein steers, or at least producing them and then selling them to calf ranches. And in addition to that, we have steer number 5, which is a beef dairy cross. And so that's a very growing part of the industry as well. And believe it or not, these 2 types of cattle make up about 13 to 15% of the total beef supply that we harvest from a fed beef animal situation. So imagine, there are a lot of these types of cattle that we harvest that are sold as beef. And we're going to get to know these types of cattle better as we go through, along with the 3 beef animals. So we're going to show you videotape here in a little bit after we go through and talk about the important criteria for quality grade and yield grade. And then Dr. Cleere is going to talk about how to relate what I talk about to a live animal. And then we're going to turn you loose and have you do some evaluation on some cattle. So let's start. So also, Ranch TV is a YouTube Ranch TV. There's 1,200 videos there on ranching. Just wanted to let you know that. You'll find, if you should have already gotten a link for a video that we have put in there, along with all those other links. There's one specifically to these cattle, and we sent that in a email yesterday, the link for that particular video. And if you just Google August Virtual Beef 706, that video also will show up as well just by doing that. So in those 5 animals, you'll see videotape of those both here tonight live, as well as you can go back and look at them on YouTube as well in that Ranch TV channel. All right, so let's talk about grading. So here's a gentleman with a blue hat, and he wears a blue hat, and that hat also has a symbol on it for the USDA Ag Marketing Service. And so what we're going to kind of think about is that carcass that's standing in front of him, how do we look at that carcass and determine value? What is important with respect to value when we look at these animals? And so we talk about beef grading. USDA has 2 grading systems within that for beef. They have yield grading and quality grading. And this gentleman works for the Ag Marketing Service of USDA, which is a voluntary system. Now there's another group within USDA that is in the plan as well, but they work for the Food Safety and Inspection System, and that is a mandatory. So every single animal has to be inspected for safety and wholesomeness. That's required by law. There's inspectors in there that are looking at them every single day. In fact, we'll find out that beef cattle are the most regulated as far as inspected food product that we have. because they are looked at least 6 times through this process as live animals, as carcasses, through the processing into the boxed beef. And so very highly inspected for safety and wholesomeness. But USDA Ag Marketing Service is the one that assesses value. They're a third party that is placed in the plant for the purpose of assessing value of these particular carcasses. So let's talk about what are they looking at. Well, we're going to talk about the USDA beef quality grading system tonight, and you're going to be an expert grader before this is over with. And then in addition to that, there's a yield grading system, which is an estimate of red meat yield in a carcass, and you'll teach you how to do that as well. You'll be surprised how good you can get at that as we go through tonight. So why is grading important? And a lot of producers say, well, we don't need grades. Our cattle are all pretty much the same. One beef animal is the same as another beef animal. And I just have 2 videotapes of trucks of cattle coming off the trucks. Nothing wrong with these cattle. It's more to show the diversity of the types of animals that we have. So you saw even on that truck, which had Brahman influenced cattle. Here's some more that are English, exotic, large European, continental European cattle. See, just one truck. This came from one pen of cattle out of a feed yard. And you can see that probably not every one of these animals is going to have the same amount of bone, the same amount of fat and muscle and marbling. Probably the eating quality of the meat from these animals is not going to be the same. They were all maybe fed a little differently, more days on feed, implant strategies. And because of that, what we're going to try to do with the grading system is segment these cattle into a more similar homogeneous group according to grade and ultimately value. So just so what they're doing there, they're spraying the animals to kind of cool them off when they get off the truck, because it can get hot. So they're going to try to keep them cool. This facility, they have access to water, diamond cut floors to keep them from slipping. I'd like to show just this video. Notice the 2 animals, you got a Holstein and a full-blood Brahman next to each other. And I thought you can just see the variation that we have in our industry. And this may be, in some cases, the first time these cattle have been sorted for something to do with at least the eating quality of the meat that those animals are going to possess. Not always, but that's not likely going to happen. So as those cattle go into the plant, they're going to start off, of course, we have a live weight, but one important criteria is dressing percent. And dressing percent is important because what dressing percent tells us is of that live animal, what percent of that live animal ends up in the form of a carcass. And on average, within the Texas Panhandle area, the average dressing percent is 64.5%, which means of a 1,000-pound animal, if that animal had a 64.5% dress, you multiply 1,000 times 0.645, and that means the resulting carcass of that animal is 645 pounds. And you can see a 1,200-pound animal, a 1,400-pound animal. So why is that important? Because if I'm selling, ultimately we're going to learn about selling carcasses or these animals on a carcass basis. So the number of pounds of carcass is going to be important. And there are actually, within the Holsteins, we're going to find out that there is a kind of a minimum dressing percent that's required in order, without receiving discounts. They have 61.5%. Some plants, and I'm just sending out generalities in this, 61.5% might be a typical minimum dressing percent required without receiving discounts from the packer himself. What is dressing percent or dress off? That's another term, or drop, because it drops off the carcass as they're harvesting it. And those are, of course, hide and the feeds and the blood and internal organs and whatever fills in the digestive system. And some of those traits that we might think about. So again, so we take a look at, that's what the dressing percent. So that is an important criteria that we'll talk about throughout this as we look at those 5 animals. They will be different in dressing percent. All right, so let's talk now about quality grade. Quality grade is an estimate of how good that meat's going to taste. So hopefully you have a good steak there. And that steak, as you look at it, it's a nice center cut sirloin steak. And what is that steak going to taste like? Well, that's what quality grade is supposed to tell us. how good that's going to taste. And that's juiciness, flavor, tenderness. So what can we look at on a carcass to give us an idea of how good that meat's going to taste? And so here's the official USDA quality grading chart. And if you look at this chart, you'll see across the top, it says Carcass Maturity. The reason that is probably 80% of the time, we don't know the age of the animal, the actual age of an animal when it comes into that plant. Well, back in the days when we were doing quite a bit more trace back and we were doing verified, age verified for shipping to Japan and things like that, we probably had more of those cattle. We knew some actual ages, give or take, a month or so. And so as you look at that Carcass Maturity, we're going to look at the carcass to tell how old the animal is. And you'll notice that this chart was divvied up into 5 groups. And you'll see A and B, C, D, and E. So A and B maturity, you'll notice that the cattle that fall into that category are eligible for prime, choice, select, and standard. If they cross over into the older maturity groups, C, D, and E, quite often that's a cull cow or a cull bull that's been used for breeding purposes or outlived its usefulness as a breeding animal and went to what we call a second career. And that second career, of course, is going to be a hamburger for somebody, or steaks or strips of meat, but as you look at it, those animals would qualify for the commercial utility grade. So we'll go through the ages here, the rough chronological ages for these different categories. But notice that if you want prime, choice, select, standard, you're going to have the A maturity, and that in B maturity, it's prime, choice, and standard. There is no select grade for B maturity. And then if they cross over over into the C maturity, is commercial and utility. So how do you know whether that animal is prime, choice, select, or standard? You're going to look in that right side, left side, as you look at the screen on the left-hand side where it says marbling. There are fanciful names that describe the amount of marbling that's in that ribeye. So let's first of all, before we talk more about marbling, let's talk about the age of the animal. And so as animals get older, the meat gets tougher. That's why it's in here in the first place. Because what the research would show, as animals get older, the meat gets tougher. And on average, approximate chronological age for an A maturity animal would be between 9 months and 30 months. If it's less than 9 months, then it would be called calf. And if it's less than about 3 months, it would be called veal. But this, again, is a rough chronological age because we may not have birth records. Very likely aren't going to know the age of that animal when it comes into the packing plant. And so we're going to look at the carcass to determine the age. Notice B maturity is 30 to 42 approximately. And at 42 months, 3.5 years, 3.5 years old, that's when you break into the C maturity category and have a whole different set of grades. So what does a grader look at very quickly to look at and determine the age of an animal? Well, it is pretty easy. They look at the skeleton of the animal and they look at the color of the lean. So notice here we have a bright cherry red color. You look at my cursor, and if you look at the darker colored ribeye, that animal was an E maturity animal, very old. The other one was an A maturity. So the color of the lean gets darker with age. That has to do with the increase in myoglobin within the muscle, not hemoglobin in blood, but myoglobin, which is in muscle, increases just for that muscle to hold on to oxygen better. It's a biological function that makes that meat a darker color. So what does the skeletal look like? How does a grader look at the skeleton right here that you see in the middle of this picture? And how can they quickly know whether it's an old or young animal? And so what you're seeing here is a carcass that's hanging from its Achilles tendon. And right where my cursor up here at the top is the round. If you go down to the other end, that's the head, would have been down here. That's the neck. Here's the chuck, the rib, loin, and round area. So this is the forequarter of the animal, the front end of the animal. This is the hind end. So what's happened is they've taken a whole carcass and they've split it right down the middle, and we're seeing two sides of that same animal. So we call that a half or a side of beef. So that's a swinging side. That's what they would call that. And what a grater is going to do is that they're going to look below where that carcass was ribbed. So notice we have a half of an animal here, and they've taken and they've ribbed the carcass between the 12th rib and the 13th rib. And I will show you a video of that process here in the near future. So the 12th rib is down here, the 13th rib, they rib between those. What's below that, down here on the bottom side, is called the forequarter. The upper part is called the hindquarter. So again, full carcass, this is a half or a side, then we quarter it, so forequarter, hindquarter. So if we look at that backbone of that animal just below that ribeye, they're going to look at that, and you're going to see, we're going to kind of now go over here where it says A, and you're going to see the body of the vertebrae. And then you're going to see right next to that, you'll see the, let's go back one. You'll see the spinal canal. That's where the spinal cord was, where that's removed out of every animal. And then you'll see what we call feather bones, official name, spinous process. Comes out of the backbone. They look like peacock feathers, so they call them feather bones. And then we look at the very tip of those feather bones. We see a white cartilage tip. This next layer is the fat layer, and what would have been on top of that is the hide of the animal. So we're looking at those cartilage tips, and it's a phenomenon that happens in all animals. So right now my knees creak when I walk, and that's because I have bone rubbing against bone making a cracking noise. And that's a normal function. I used to have nice soft cartilage between my joints, and now it's hard bone rubbing against hard bone. And so we have the same phenomenon happening in beef animals. What happens is that cartilage turns from this white, soft tissue to hard bone. Here's the B maturity animal, and here's the button that I'll outline. You'll notice on the very tip of that button, you'll see a little bit of red. That is bone that started to be changed from cartilage to bone. It's called ossification. That's the process. And it's a gradual process, and a lot of times it works from the tip back towards the feather bone. So here we'll go down to C maturity, and we'll look at that button, and notice all the red that's inside. It doesn't look white and soft. It has been replaced by bone. And then finally the E maturity, which I'll outline where the button was, it doesn't exist anymore because that animal's so old. So, and a grater can look at this carcass below this ribeye and look at that part, those chine buttons, that's what we call them, on the tip of the vertebrae, and they can immediately know whether that animal is old or young. Now, cattle that come out of a feed yard that are harvested in those plants that harvest feed yard cattle, 95 out of 100 times, those animals look just like this A maturity. In fact, all 5 animals that you're looking at tonight will be A maturity. They're all young animals. They all came out of the feed yard, and they all are A maturity. And so that's how they're determined the age. Now, once you determine that they're A maturity, for example, now how do you know what grade they're in? And so what they're going to do is they're going to take this ribeye up here. If you notice, again, going back up to the carcass, and you'll see the ribeye, and in that ribeye, you'll see the 12th rib cross section. And what that looks like, if we move over now to the pictures, looks like one of these pictures. And so what the grader is going to ask themselves is, of what I see, the flecks of fat inside this muscle called marbling, how much of that is there, and what picture does it best look like? So if they look in this ribeye and they see something that looks about like this slight picture that you see at the bottom, then that carcass is A maturity and slight. So we're going to go A maturity, and we're going to go down this list of marbling where we see the word slight. And we go across, and guess what? That's USDA select. So that carcass, if it had that amount of marbling, it would be select. In fact, that picture represents the very minimum that an A maturity carcass can have and be in the select grade. So it represents this big black line. We actually sometimes say that's a slight 0 picture. That's the minimum amount of marbling an A maturity carcass can have and be in the select grade. What if it has less than this? Okay, if it has less than that select grade or slight amount of marbling, that picture that you see there, it's going to be in the standard grade. Probably haven't ever heard of that. Another term that we use in industry to describe those cattle that might fall into that is called no roll. No roll, and I'll explain that more in detail. But some of you may have heard that, and that would be no roll. So here we have the slight. Now, what does it take to be USDA choice? Well, it says small, so let's go look at the picture. This picture is called small. And in fact, again, this is the small 0 picture. In other words, that is the very minimum that an A maturity carcass can have and be in the choice grade. So it actually represents the black line for choice. Okay, let's step back for a second. Let's go back to select. So what if the picture has somewhere between a slight amount of marbling and this one that's called small? Anything between that is called slight. That's a slight amount of marbling. It's between this line and this line. And so it would be USDA select.
You're on mute, Dr. Hale.
Okay. So what would it take to be prime? Well, that's the next question. I don't think anybody's missed anything. What would it take to be prime? And if you look at prime, it's that picture for slightly abundant. That is the very minimum that an A maturity carcass can have and be in the prime grade. And so as we kind of walk through this, if see the slight picture, if it's less than that, it's USDA standard. If it's between slight and small, somewhere between those two pictures, it's USDA select. If it's between small and slightly abundant, somewhere between those two pictures, it's USDA choice. And if it's the slightly abundant picture or greater, it's USDA prime. Now there's one other kind of fanciful grade term that's not an official grade that people refer to quite often, and that is top choice. What is top choice? Well, if you look at top choice programs, they require a modest amount of marbling. So within the choice grade, we're going to refer to it break it into two sections, what we would call low choice, which would be carcasses with a small amount of marbling, and those that are between modest and slightly abundant, that are modest or moderate, those are in those two categories, we would call top choice. Certified Angus beef, sterling silver, JBS Swift, 1855 Swifts, Tyson's Chairman Reserve, all of those have a beef or a sterling silver XL, a Cargill program. All those programs, as you look at them, they have a modest amount of marbling as the requirement for marbling, and we call that a premium choice or top choice program. Okay, so I've set your eye. Look at these pictures, and now we're going to ask you to grade some carcasses. Okay, so again, looking at the set your eye, we're going to ask you to grade some to take a look at. We're going to assume they're all A maturity. And if you see something between the slight picture and the small picture, remember that is USDA select. If it's less than this picture, it's standard. There's low choice. Anything but that picture and the picture for modest would be low choice. That modest picture or that moderate picture, if you see something like that, it's top choice. If you see either one of these pictures, they're prime. The slightly abundant or moderately abundant. So here we go. So if you could get into your chat and write down and type into your chat whether you think this carcass is going to be select or standard, select, low choice, top choice, or prime. So type in one of those. These are your options: standard, select, low choice, top choice, and prime. Got a lot of primes, that's for sure. As you look at that, that's cool. I think you guys are following it. Yeah, that's an easy prime. That's a Wagyu Angus cross steer that we produced here at Texas A&M University at our McGregor Research Station. And we have some of those genetics here as well. So very high amount of marbling in that particular one. All right, let's go to the next one. Get ready to type in there again. All right, what's this one? Standard, type it in there. Oh, again, we got a lot of primes again. Way to go. They say, I want to eat that one. That's seen a lot of good stuff there. That's cool. Yep, that's another prime. So what percent of the population are prime nowadays? About 8.5% of national average are prime, USDA prime. And so sometimes 7%, back in the day it was 2 or 3%, but now it's grown quite a bit. All right, so let's take a look at the next one. Man, another really high quality one, huh? Are they all like this? No, this is another prime. I do want you to kind of just look at that though. Notice that the fat differences. So people, first thing ask, well, what is outside fat? You know, the fat opposite the eye, we call this subcutaneous fat. That's not in the yield grade equation. Excuse me, that's not in the quality grade. Only marbling and maturity, the flecks of fat inside the ribeye. And so you will see that here's a prime, there's a prime, okay? And so there are cattle that have the genetics to do these kind of things. Finding those cattle, even with, you know, this animal has about 5/10 of an inch of fat opposite the ribeye. This animal has about an inch, okay? But so still, regardless, we'll get to yield grade in a minute, but that's in the yield grade, outside fat. But for quality grade, only marbling, the flecks of fat inside the ribeye, and the age of the ribeye. You might notice at the bottom of this picture, you'll see that cartilage tip, nice white soft cartilage tip. Again, another A maturity animal. So what is this one? What do you think this one's going to be? Getting a little bit more kind of difference of opinion. So a grader is going to ask themselves this. They're going to ask themselves, okay, so in this select, is this better than the select? Yes, of course. Is it better than low choice? Yes. Is it better than this top choice picture? Yes. Is it better than the moderate? Yes. Is it better than the slightly abundance? And I think it's close. And I think I'm going to call it today moderate amount of marbling, which would make it into top choice. Now, you guys might be upset with me, but today I'm the official grader that was placed in the plant by USDA Ag Marketing Service. And so, you know, you can argue, but whatever I say is the official grade, right? Okay, let's take a look at the next one. So how about this one? And seeing some good comments as people are going through. And so in a minute, we'll finish up with quality grade, and Jason will let you kind of go through some of the comments or questions that we have out there. Okay, but right now let's finish up just evaluating these, and then we'll go through that in a minute. So this is the top choice, that's right. Okay, here's another one that's close. I think I'm going to call it top choice today. I would point out that this is called lightning fat. This is fat that's connected to the outside. Marbling is totally encircled by lean. And so it's called intramuscular fat. This is not marbling, and this is not marbling over here. So always have to keep those things in consideration. All right, what about this one? Okay, you're right, it's fat. No doubt about it. But what grade is it? And it looks like, as you're typing in there, no, it's going to be a USDA select. Again, this is not marbling here or here. And so I think it doesn't have enough to get into that low choice grade. Okay, but so it's somewhere between that picture for slight and picture for small, so that would make it USDA select. All right. So next one. Okay, here's another select. And what about this one? What do you think this grade's going to be? Yep. Got a lot of good cutter canner. It is a maturity. And so the question is, there's a possibility those animals could be utility, but that's for B maturity animals. So it's a maturity. So the lowest grade it's going to have today is practically devoid, which would put it into the USDA standard. So you kind of get an idea how these grades work. And so Jason, I'll open it up for a few questions if you saw any of those or comments that you think are worthy of sharing.
Yeah, Dan, we had just a few comments in there, and we were able to kind of chat them up and respond to the whole group. So I think we're good.
Okay, good. Thank you. And so Jason's answering those one-on-one too. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and we also have Dr. Griffin and Dr. Gill that's helping answer them too tonight. So,
oh, hey, thank you. Thank you. All right, so let's move on to yield grading. So in yield grading, we have yield grade 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There are 5 yield grades. So remember, quality grade, which we just talked about, is an estimate of how good the meat's going to taste. Tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. Yield grade is an estimate of how much meat am I going to get out of this carcass and how much fat and bone I'm going to have to throw away. And so, the real definition of yield grade is percent closely trimmed boneless retail cuts from the round loin, rib, and chuck. And so if you look at round loin, rib, and chuck, you're talking about retail cuts, closely trimmed, boneless. So you're kind of just thinking about, okay, what factors can I use to measure that in a beef carcass? What we do have here is a picture above the picture of the ribeyes, and you'll see this is a cross section in front of the front leg. So what I'm pointing to is the brisket of the animal, and this is the front leg. And so the picture that has all that fat in it is a yield grade 4, and the one that looks trimmer is a yield grade 2. And so, when we talk about fat, we talk about, first of all, fat on the outside. That's called subcutaneous fat. And we have fat seamed between muscles. We call that seam fat. That's intermuscular fat. And then we have marbling, which is the fat that's distributed inside the muscle. What yield grade's going to try to tell us is, of this carcass, after all the trimming, bones taken out, how much is going to end up in the form of saleable boxed beef. That's another way to think of it. Some people refer to it as lean meat yield or red meat yield. All right, so there are 4 factors, and we're not going to go in depth into this. And if you want to go in depth, we'll show you some videos here that you can go to in the future to take a look at that. As you look at yield grade, the first and most important criteria is a measurement of fat opposite the ribeye. Remember, we're about looking at the 12th rib cross section. And so they will actually take a ruler, and nowadays they use an instrument. In old days, a grader would actually just estimate it with their eye, but now they have an instrument that does all these measurements that I'm about to talk about. And so when you look at that, they'll take a measurement opposite the ribeye. Notice where that measurement's being taken. And sometimes you'll see it referred to as the 3/4 fat depth measure at the 12th rib. And so here we have the carcass has been ribbed between the 12th, the 13th rib is out of view right now. This is the 4/4. Here's those buttons that we talked about. Okay, as we look at that ribeye, from the bottom of the ribeye to the top, 3/4 of the way up, we'll take a measurement at that time. This is the first and probably most important measurement that we have in determining yield grade. And so this is the starting point. A term that Dr. Cleere will use when he's talking about evaluating live cattle is PYG, preliminary yield grade, the starting yield grade. So the starting yield grade for this animal would be 3.75. It measured 7/10 opposite the ribeye. And if you look at that, the starting yield grade for that carcass will be 3.75. Okay, so we go back one more time. So I know my picture's covering that up, but it would be a 3.75. So that's PYG, or starting yield grade. Next is weight. So imagine that carcass, if it gained 50 pounds that we're looking at back here, that carcass gained 50 pounds, it's going to be gaining fat. Right now, that carcass is in what we call the rapid fattening phase of its life. And so it's gaining, when it gains weight at this point, from a carcass standpoint, it's gaining carcass fat. And so as those cattle get heavier, they tend to get fatter. Now remember, there's 5 yield grades. 1 is the best. 1 is the highest percent, closely trimmed, boneless cuts from that carcass. 5 is the worst. The high numbers are bad in this system. 5 would have the lowest percent, closely trimmed, boneless retail cuts from that carcass. And so remember, 1's good, 5's bad, And so pluses are bad in the system. So notice you start with a preliminary yield grade, and then you would adjust that based off of weight. And as that animal gets heavier, that animal is getting fatter generally as well. Another factor that's for muscling is ribeye area. So we'll call it the ribeye. You'll hear us refer to that ribeye on that animal, or ribeye area. And we're talking again about the area of the muscle at the 12th rib. And so here's an example. We're just talking about the one single muscle. It's the long isthmus muscle. That's the Latin name for it. And as you take a look, we're looking at this one big muscle, not all these little muscles around the side. What is the area of that muscle? And so I've taken a picture both before and after instrument camera identified the ribeye. And so you can see that as that ribeye gets bigger, that's generally a pretty good indication that that carcass is getting more muscular everywhere else. All right, then the last thing, which is not given to the grader now to utilize and put in a calculation, is percent kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. Many plants now pull this out. That is the fat that's inside the body cavity. And so if you can imagine this hindquarter, remember we have the carcass. If we look at the forequarter down here, that heart of that animal would have sat right here. And so that's called heart fat. And then if we look up into the hindquarter and we turn it, we'll see over here where it says pelvic fat and kidney fat, we'll see what it looks like inside. And that is just natural fat that surrounds the organs of the animal. And so as you look at that, we have heart fat, we have kidney fat, and pelvic fat. So a lot of times we'll call that KPH, or percent kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. And of course, as you get more of that there, that's pure fat. And so you'll notice that the pluses get high. The average probably kidney, pelvic, and heart fat in animals, it would be about 2%. Some plants maybe 2.5%. And when they pull it on the harvest floor, what their USDA's allow them to use is to use a standard percent kidney, pelvic, and heart fat in the equation when they calculate the yield grades. All right, so those are the factors. Okay, those 4 factors are what used to determine a yield grade. And so it gives you an idea. But we can pretty much eyeball cattle and hopefully look at the ribeyes to kind of relate a yield grade 1 versus a 5. So just look at these pictures. First of all, these are pictures that were put out by USDA. And you'll see just as you look at them, just the change in the face, the jowl as that animal goes from a yield grade 1 to a yield grade 5. You see a change in the briskets. Okay, Dr. Cleere is going to go into all those, but just look at that. But if we looked at those animals right in the middle of the animal between the 12th and 13th rib, that's what it would look like over here. That's the cross section of a yield grade 1. And remember, where do we measure fats? Well, we measure it from the bottom of the ribeye to the top, 3/4 of the way, and take a fat measurement right where my cursor is now. So you can compare that to a yield grade 2, to a yield grade 3, 4, and 5. And so, you know, without really doing a whole lot of calculations, you can kind of eyeball cattle. So we're going to ask you now to yield grade some cattle. So here we have, these are your options, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, when you do a calculation, it might calculate out to be a 2.2 or a 2.9. What would the yield grade of that be? It would be a yield grade 2. That's right, Jody. Way to go. Jody is kind of, I'm glad we got him on here. So it's a yield grade 2. So as we look at a yield grade 2, anything between a 2.0 and 2.9999 is a yield grade 2. And so yield grade 2, if we take a look at that, anything behind the decimal point of that, the whole number is what counts. Behind the decimal point is taken off. So it's a yield grade 2. So let's take a look at this. So again, we're going to compare it to the 5 pictures, and we're going to take a measurement right at that point. So what yield grade, type in the chat, what yield grade do you think this is? Yeah, a lot of 1s. Yeah, see a 2, that's okay. Just starting out. All right, let's take a look at the next one. So what do you see? There's a few lines on there, just kind of ignore those. I'm not sure how that happened, but as you take a look at it, as you look at that ribeye, what yield grade is that one? Yeah, it's a yield grade 1. Again, here's a top choice, yield grade 1. Okay, how about this one? Yep, that's what I estimated. You know, we don't know what the weight is. I'm sure all the purists out there say, I don't know what the weight is of that animal, so it's hard to tell. It could have a light weight and be really large ribeye. It could, but just kind of ballparking right now, just to kind of give you an idea and to help us remember that the leaner ones, the more muscular ones are closer to a yield grade 1. The fatter ones are closer to a yield grade 5, and high numbers are bad. All right, so what's this one? Yep, yield grade 2. Good job. Okay, how about this one? So I'm seeing a few 3s. It's important to know where do you measure fat. So I'm going from the bottom of the ribeye to the top 3/4 of the way and measure fat at that place. Now, so that's where if I'm looking at that place, it's a yield grade. It'll end up being a yield grade 2 just looking at it. But the weight of the animal is still a criteria. We don't know that. We don't know the kidney knob. Well, let's assume that they're all 2% kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, just for the sake of that assumption. So as you look at that, you know, you're asking yourself, okay, how big a ribeye is that? And I will let you know that what a grader can do is they can look at this one point where they measure fat for actual fat. So again, 3/4 of the way up from the ribeye, from the bottom to the top, 3/4. Take a measurement, measure fat, and here we go. That looks like it's about 5/10 or 3/10. Okay, but I can look at the rest of the carcass and ask myself or herself, if the grader, if you take a look at it, does that one measurement really represent what I see through the rest of the carcass? So they'll look over the round, and we'll talk a little bit about that and see some of the carcass pictures from the animals that that we have that you'll be looking at as we go forward and looking at the video of the live cattle. So this one definitely, I think, is a yield grade 3. Okay, how about this one? What do you think this one is? At 2 or 3, it's on that line. Okay, how about this one? Oh, getting up to a 4, it's probably on the higher side of a 3, but both of those I think probably would be 3. It's kind of the point. So you have a yield, kind of one that's closer to a 4, but it's a 3. Other one's closer to a 2, and it's a 3. Okay, here we go. How about this one? Yeah, 4s and 5s. How about that one? Yeah, that's a definite 5. Calculate out to be a 5/6. How about that one? Yeah, so you look at a carcass, the good news, this one calculated out to be over a 7. But yeah, too much is right. As you look at it, the highest you can be is a yield grade 5. That's the worst you can be. All right, so any questions on yield grade before we kind of just show the grading process? And then I think I'm going to end up turning it over to you, Jason, after we show the grading process in the plants. Any questions though before we start that? Yeah, so the question I see from Tracy Sadler is the yield grade is independent of quality grade. And I will show you a slide that kind of shows the relationship between outside fat and quality grade. But in the true grading system, quality grade and yield grade are independent of each other as far as those grades that are applied to a carcass. So that's true.
Dr. Hale?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Davey, go for it.
Hey, I answered a question we had earlier about dark cutters and what they do in terms of grading, and also if there's any difference in flavor or anything like that. But you may want to just visit about that as one of those defects that we see from time to time.
Right, and so we do have dark cutting. I'll show you a picture of dark cutting here tonight in a little bit. We'll talk through that. But yes, we will do that. That's good. And that was the voice of Davey Griffin, who is an extension meat specialist for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. And of course, Ron Gill is also on, who's the associate department head for Extension in the Department of Animal Science here at Texas A&M.
Hey, Dan, we got a couple questions here. One is, have the quality grades remained consistent over the years, or have they changed according to improved genetics?
As far as the system itself, or?
No, just are the quality grades improved as a percentage? and what does it do to?
That's a really good question. And so they have improved considerably. You know, we started doing the national beef quality audits in 1991. And so, you know, we would look at that and roughly, you know, if you look at USDA data going back, we would see, you know, back starting about the 70s, grades were probably very likely percent choice and prime in that 50% category. And now we're in that 75 plus percent, 85% of those cattle now are prime or choice as you put those two together in those categories. And so we have improved greatly. Before that, in the 60s, they used confirmation, of course. So there have been changes in how we grade cattle. And before that, dating back to, I think, in 1975, you know, we were in the 70% for percent cattle that graded choice and prime back then. But we had the cattle that, you know, the continental European cattle that came in, generally put a lot of emphasis when they did on muscle production and not on marbling. But most of the breeds have kind of circled around and are putting more emphasis on marbling. And so we have seen that increase considerably over the years. Anything else, Jason?
Yeah, there was another one Dustin sent in. You know, the packing plants have been backed up, cattle have been backed up. I mean, we're slowly working ourselves out of that. Have we seen the yield grades increase over the last few months as those cattle kind of backed up?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know that answer. So we can look that up. Maybe Davey, do you have any idea what you've seen in any of the data? Or I know Jody, if he can type in the box, Jody Pitcox, who with USDA, would have maybe some of that information. Appreciate you being on, Jody.
With carcasses being heavier, Dr. Hale, we're probably seeing yield grade being a little higher just because, you know, if we're looking at almost a 900-pound average on carcass weight right now, obviously they're going to continue to grow some muscle there, but we're probably going to get more fat deposited on those bigger cattle than we would muscle at that point.
Yep. Remember, as cattle get heavier, they tend to get fatter. So it really kind of goes with the weights and how current we are with cattle. All right, let's show, just talk a little bit about and show you the plants. So I have a couple of plants that are mixed together here. And so we'll look at the grading process. So you're seeing it taking a circular saw. He just ribbed the carcass through the vertebrae between the 12th and 13th rib. And then that gentleman is taking a knife and opening it up the cross section of the 12th, 13th rib. And so those cattle are going through a serpentine chain back and forth, as you see here in just a second, but they're still doing the ribbing process. But they go back and forth until about 20 minutes after that animal has been ribbed, and that allows the meat color to bloom to a bright cherry red color. Now this is, they're using the old beef cam on this particular instrument grading. We will show you a little bit of E+V here that was given to me by Stephen Shackelford at US Meat Animal Research Center. But you can see after about 20 minutes where they allow the color of the muscle to bloom to a bright cherry red color. It's a natural process. When exposed to air, it goes from a purple color to a bright cherry red color. Then they take this picture. The computer quantifies yield grade and quality grade. Now instead of 65%, it actually would put a calculated yield grade in that place. Appreciate the plants that allowed me in the plant to actually videotape this. And then you take a look at all the data. There's actually fat color and lean color and other things that are involved in that. Here's a E+V, which is the newer system that most plants are using today for their instrument grading. Very similar, just the angle of the camera, the lighting's a little different, some of the technology's different. But so the carcasses are not graded by this instrument. The carcasses, they collect data, and then the grader with a, with a blue hat, the person in there with Ag Marketing Service, looks at the data and puts the official grade on the carcass. And so the machines don't put the official grade. It's the actual grader themselves that look at the data, look at the ribeye, say, okay, that's correct or that's not correct. And then whatever the grader says ultimately is the grader. So you just looked at a real fat ribeye. Here's a real lean animal. There's going to be some value differences in those two in there. And so here's the USDA grader that looked at the data, looking at that. And then he just pop stamped it with the actual grade of that carcass. So you can take a look at that, kind of get an idea. This is a gentleman with a yellow hat, works with, for the company, the plant itself, and is sorting those carcasses for fabrication, which we'll learn more about tomorrow. Fabrication is the process of taking these carcasses and breaking them up into boxed beef, into roasts and major cuts that then a retailer will cut into steaks and roasts. So you can kind of get an idea of the speed at which the machine and the grader is working. And it's pretty easy. You know, I can look at this next one that's coming up, and that's a select yield grade 2. Just kind of the way that works. And the gentleman with the yellow, the green hat is at a switching board, sees the quality of the animal, hits a button, and those carcasses are railed off according to quality grade, yield grade, weight combinations, and getting prepared for fabrication. All right, so there's a really fat one. Take a look at it. Okay, so this is what E plus V looks like, what that machine looks like nowadays, and the data that's gathered from the machines that a grader would look at that and say, yes, I agree or disagree. That is a yield grade 2, probably top choice, just looking at it. Probably top choice. Okay, last question before we go to Dr. Cleere. Last slide. And that would be just looking at those, if you take a look at this chart, because it's the question everybody asks, almost every beef 706, what's the relationship between outside fat and marbling? Okay, now we told you that yield grade and quality grade are separate grades that apply to the carcasses, but there is a small relationship. As cattle get fatter, they tend to have more marbling in the ribeye, but that again is not a perfect relationship, and genetics has a lot to play into that. So let's kind of look at the data here. Across the bottom is you'll see it says 1/4 of an inch, 0.25, then 3/10, 4/10, all the way up to greater than 1.05. And if you look down the side, you'll see a percentage. That's the percent of the different grades. So what are the different grades? Well, the gray line is prime. Okay, the mustard, yellow kind of colored line is choice. The brownish line is select. And the green line is other, which is mostly the standard beef. It could be a few of the older animals that happen to make it to the fed beef plants. And what you're going to look at as you look at that, we're looking at the 12th rib fat thickness. So this is where we measure fat for yield grade. Okay, so what is the quality grade as we go from one to the other? This is the set of 2 million data points. And so out of the National Beef Quality Audit from several years ago, we took that out and we divided those 2 million groups by this fat measurement that you see opposite the ribeye. And so as you kind of tick up, what I like to do is just follow this choice line as you go from 2500s and kind of tick up all the way up to, well, it gets to the 73. And it starts to plateau at that point. And if you draw a line down, that's 6500s. And so you'll see, at least within the normal beef population within the United States, those normal kind of beef breeds that we have here in the U.S., not Japanese breeds, but beef breeds, those cattle will kind of plateau over time. And you'll notice that about 6,500s. And it's not unusual to see, feeders feeding the cattle as heavy as they can. You minimize that. First of all, they don't want yield grade 4s, but they want to get as much weight on them as they can, as long as it's feed efficiently smart to do that. So they'll tick up there and they'll feed about to that level. So what's happening to select as we go from there, we're going down to 21% select and 4% prime at that point, and 5%. Again, this is the millions of data points that we had out of that National Beef Quality Audit. And so notice that we still have, even when we get over an inch of fat, we still have some selects. We have more primes, that's for sure. We still have some that would fit standard or hard bone or older animals that might have had it kind of broken into that. So there are cattle out there, I think, that you could feed as long as you want. They're never going to grade choice. And so always something to kind of keep in mind. So as you look at that and we look at those grades, kind of think about that, that, and Dr. Cleere will now kind of talk about, how we use fatness to measure quality grade, but that it's not anywhere a perfect relationship as you go forward.
Yeah, Dan, as you have that slide put up there, I think that's a good point to bring up is, as you can see, when they're feeding cattle out and finishing them in the feed yard, they're trying to optimize, looking at that half-inch kind of time frame there, finishing those cattle out 1/2 inch to 6/10, because that really gives them a chance to, express their genetic ability to marble. And then the feeder, as you said, has to start thinking about, okay, what happens to my cost of gain as they continue to get fatter, which efficiency goes down, but then also the yield grade issue too. So that's a pretty important graph right there.
Okay, Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and I'll take over. And Davey, you can help me kind of monitor the chat as we go through here. And
yeah, Dan, I got one question for you though. It's a pretty good one. We get this a lot. It comes from Barry. He said that he gets a question a lot. He works out of Houston and about Wagyu grading on restaurant menus and kind of how they, where would they fall within kind of our grading system? You already showed a half blood, so.
Sure, you bet. So yeah, as you take a look at grading for Wagyu cattle, Akushi cattle, they deposit marbling differently. They deposit marbling and really never plateau. You look at the data, they're actually missing an enzyme in the way that fat's deposited that allows them to never stop depositing marbling. And so that's why you see them quite often get the 1,500, 1,600 pounds. And so they would be prime plus if they were purebred Wagyu cattle and if they were fed according to the Japanese standards. A lot of times crosses may not, I've seen Wagyu crosses that have been USDA choice, but if you look at when you breed an animal to a Wagyu or a Akushi, you're going to increase the marbling level in their progeny of your cattle pretty significantly. But the question is that something that's important to you when you're marketing cattle? And can you capitalize on those genetics? So those are things that we're going to talk about in 2 days from now when we talk about the beef production side. And that would be on Thursday night. We'll actually kind of address some of those topics about what's really important in beef production. Marbling is a factor, but when you look at that. But as far as Wagyu cattle, they would, on average, have more marbling than what we might typically see within the United States. And they would be in that prime plus category.
And Dan, I think that's something to bring up too is, we've got different quality grades of cattle, which translates to different quality levels of product. And, I made the trip to Japan and China a couple of years ago to promote U.S. beef. And we ate some, sure enough, Japanese Wagyu. And before we cooked it, it was literally almost just white. It was so heavy marbled. And the average consumer today, that's probably a little much. It was a little much for me. But then we have consumers on the other end of the spectrum that are looking for leaner cuts of beef as well. So, all of those quality grades are important, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. That's for sure. Yep.
So that's just something we always bring up. We keep, everybody says more marbling, but we got to realize we also have to meet the consumer needs too.
Not every one of them wants a lot of marbling. That's true too. As you look at that.
Jason?
Yeah, David, go ahead.
On Barry's question too, I think part of that is, that a lot of times the breed is being used, the breed name is being used to advertise that, and does that really relate to a grade? And Dr. Hale answered it there, but you know, it's the same with Angus too. You know, when we really get down to it, that really doesn't tell us anything about grade. It does say that those animals do have propensity to put more marbling in if it's a grade like that, but just knowing that it is being sold as Wagyu doesn't tell you that it does carry that load of marbling that we'd expect from that. Like Dr. Hale said, you could have a choice there too. So that's one of those things, just be a little careful when you're buying. You know, I know some of our barbecue guys buy those Wagyu briskets to use in the contest and stuff. And we've had really good success with some of those when we've known that those are really high quality Wagyu cattle. But we've also had some that ate less than, not as well as our prime cattle do. And it's probably one that was a percentage Wagyu that did not have the propensity to put that kind of marbling in. So that's just one of those, I think, that you just got to be careful with just using a breed versus actually, these are third-party graders by USDA that the plant can't grade those. USDA is grading those.
Absolutely. Good point, Davey.
All right, let's move on. Jason, you're up. Yep. Jason's now going to talk to us about how we can take what we just talked about and apply it to live cattle. And after this, we're going to ask you to do some estimates on some live cattle.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to move through this pretty quickly for the sake of time this evening. And Dr. Hale's kind of gone into the quality grading and yield grading system. And so we just want to give you some indicators on live animals, some things to look for as you begin to grade those cattle. Just remember that, you know, as we look at the 5 steers we're going to look at, remember that the cattle populations across the United States vary significantly. As you can see, the top left picture there is a picture, a group of English cross steers, probably in the north. The picture in the right is a group of pretty heavy Brahman influenced steers. And then the picture on the bottom right is just kind of what we call the pen of offs, or maybe steers or heifers that just didn't fit within you know, the typical marketing channel. And you can see in that group, there's a Holstein, there's some full-blood Simmentals, some full-blood Gelbies, just a wide variety of different things that, you know, may have not fit in with a specific marketing plan. And so different types of cattle. Now, I always ask in person the question of, you know, which one of these pens, if you're just looking at them, would have, you know, potentially the highest value of carcass. And the most common answer is going to be the top left. And, you know, again, if assuming all the animals weighed the same, we would expect the pen in the top left, because they are a heavy English influence, on average, they would be higher marbling, meaning higher grading, and probably generate more value. But the key thing that I think you've got to remember is, as we're looking at these cattle, and as you progress through the next 2 nights, and it's going to be summarized on that last night where they bring it all kind of into a big picture scenario, is that, you know, I asked which pen of these cattle is going to be the highest value, but, you know, the bigger question is, you know, which one's going to make the most money and which one is going to be the most profitable. And to answer that question, I just can't look at, well, which one is going to generate the highest value. Just because we talked about the Akiushi or the Wagyu or the Japanese breeds, and yeah, we know if you can get those marketed, there's tremendous value in those cattle. But to get into that upper market, that super prime, as Dan and Davey mentioned, you know, those cattle are going to have to be fed a long period of time. It's going to take longer, more feed, and so they're going to be more expensive. And so you got to make sure you look at the big picture. So in feeding cattle, there's several components to it. It's one, what the end value of that animal is, but it's also what the cost of gain is going to be on those cattle. And so what that cost of gain is going to depend on the gain of efficiency of those cattle, just how much grain or forage, whatever your program is, it takes to put that pound of beef on. Other things that'll be talked about is, from the health of these cattle, maintaining their health, and that so that they do perform the whole time. And so again, in value is certainly important, and we're going to spend a lot of time over the next couple of nights talking about carcass quality and improving the value there. But don't forget that you've got to look at the big picture and look at what does it cost to get to that value in the big grand scheme of things. And I assume that the vast majority of you guys that are on today are also going to be in the cow-calf side of business. And so we can't forget that to produce that calf to weaning, we've got production inputs as well. And think about, carcass quality is important, but at the cow-calf level, some of the factors that we've got to realize that are important, and one of the most important ones is reproductive efficiency, wean calf crop. And the economics always point to, profitability really hinges on that wean calf crop. And pounds at weaning's important as well, and also price per pound. But you also have to realize that as we move around the United States in cattle production, the calves that I produce in Madisonville, Texas, may be different than the calves that can be produced in Nebraska, or the calves that can be produced in the Gulf Coast down in the Anahuac weaning region. You got to make sure you have cows that are adapted to your environmental conditions, that give you the reproductive rate that you need, and also don't break the bank when we're talking about production inputs. And so that brings up another point is we've got different breeds of cattle that have different quality grades of product that they produce as well. And so keep that in mind as you got to look at the big picture. And I think that's going to be summarized up some on that last evening as we wrap up this particular Beef 706. So the task at hand here in just a moment is to look at live animals. And we've got 5 steers, we've got 3 beef, we've got a dairy, straight dairy, and then we've got a half Holstein, half Angus steer to look at. And so we want you to, and we're going to have a little contest for this, and we want you to peer through the hide and put your estimates on what do you think the quality grade's going to be. So is this steer hanging on the rail there, is he going to be prime, choice, select, or standard? And then also, well, what is its yield grade going to be? And put those estimates on those. And Dr. Hale is going to talk to you about that as we go through those videos here in just a moment. And so we're going to take the live animals. We're going to go in and evaluate them on the hoof. We're going to see the processing process, but then also you're going to get the opportunity to, let's see what those 5 steers that you had, what do they look like? And what does the carcass look like? And even where's the value in those? And so you take it a step further, and Dr. Hale talked to you about the grading procedure and how we put value. And value is definitely dependent on market conditions and supply and demand, but it's also dependent on what that carcass quality is and how much of that carcass that you got to hang and ultimately sell there as well. And you're going to get the opportunity to see the fabrication process. Typically our normal Beef 706s, you get to suit up and chain up and go through some of those processes. Unfortunately, due to the situation we're in, we're not going to get to see that, but Dr. Griffin and Dr. Hale are going to really give you some good demonstrations on that as well with that. You'll get to see here in just a little bit, Dr. Hale is going to talk to you about the grid and the value of those carcasses. So I'm going to skip over that just for time today, but just remember, differences in carcass quality means differences in value as well. And so as we look at these, you've seen these similar pictures on that grading card that Dr. Hale showed you on one of the last slides that talked about yield grades and quality grades. And then I also posted the link for that card into the chat. So you can go back through the chats and click on that link. It goes to our animal science website that houses that publication. The one question we did get in the chat earlier was, you know, as far as yield grades and quality grades, if I have a steer that's a yield grade 5, does that mean that he can't be prime? And so the one thing to remember is the yield grade and quality grades are going to be independent of one another. So we can certainly have a yield grade 5 carcass that is prime. We had some cattle in here that were fed for a special program a few years ago, and we actually had one of those cattle that you would have thought would have been prime because it was so fat, but it ended up being a select yield grade 5, but when you calculated it out, it was a yield grade 7. So those are independent. Now, there are some special branded beef programs that Dr. Hale is going to talk to you about that do have some specs and may not accept those yield grade 5 carcasses. So he'll outline that when he gets into the marketing side of it. So in quality grades, we've gone through these, this particular exercise, and Dr. Hale talked to you about marbling and maturity in that. One of the questions we had, you know, it dealt with what are some factors that affect quality grade. And one, we've already talked about fat thickness, and we showed you that chart that indicated as we increased the external fat on cattle, we would expect marbling to increase. But as you could see with that, the data, we do begin to see some plateau. And the question we oftentimes get is, if I keep on feeding and feeding my steers, can I eventually get them to prime? And we talked about the Wagyu cattle, and Dr. Griffin mentioned that earlier, that Wagyu, they will keep on depositing that marbling, but most of the time our beef cattle are going to eventually play out on that. So, but fat thickness is definitely an indicator. Maturity in days on feed. Cattle have to reach their maturity level and in order for them to put on that marbling as well. So you may have an animal that is very young, it's been pushed very hard, that's, you know, an acceptable carcass weight, and because they just really hadn't reached that maturity level, they may not grade as high a marbling as what you think they would. Days on feed is certainly a factor with that. The longer the days on feed, the greater your chance that those animals would be able to marble. And that would be the same as true from a grass finished or forage finished basis as well. On that perspective, if you know the number of days on a quality forage will produce a carcass that is certainly different than the number of days on a low quality forage as well. So keep that in mind when we're thinking about forage finished. And then the last thing that's a very important factor is the effective breed type. And we know we've talked about Angus some, we talked about Wagyu. The British breeds, which Wagyu would be a Japanese breed and Akaushi would, but our British breeds, which are most common breeds here in the US, they're going to be consistent of the Angus, Red Angus, Shorthorn, Hereford, and Polled Hereford. With our Angus and Red Angus going to be on the higher end marbling of those British breeds. Again, that's on average. It's not to say that all Angus cattle are going to grade upper choice and prime. We've seen some cattle, Angus cattle, that just don't grade. They're select or standard. Again, we're going to talk about that within breed effect, but we're talking about on the breed type side, the average. Continental breeds, Dr. Hale mentioned when he was answering the question, have quality grades improved? And he talked about the continental breeds coming in the late 70s and early 80s, and there was leaner cattle. And then we saw more British cattle coming into the mix through the Angus programs. But then also we saw the Continental breeds infusing Angus genetics in them to hit those CAB marks as well. And so with that, our Continental breeds have changed dramatically in the last 30 years. And those breeds have probably tend to look a little more Angus influenced. And on average, they're going to be higher marbling than they would have been 30 or 40 years ago as well with that. And then our American breeds on average are going to be just like the Continental breeds are going to maybe be a little less marbling than your British breeds. But our Brahmin influenced breeds have made great strides in the last 20 years to really focus and look at marbling and improving the marbling of those cattle. Now, again, you're not going to maybe get on average across the breed the same percentage of primes and upper choice you would be in an Angus. But there are some of those cattle that do really well. And even Dr. Pascu is one of our livestock specialists. He grades a lot of cattle in South Texas, and he comes across some Brahmins that'll be prime out of there. And they certainly will grade, and those breeds have made great improvements. Again, we're looking at on average. So if you look at across that board, we would expect on average the British to be a little higher marbling than the Continental and then the American with that. But then there's the within breed effects, and that's the curveball that is a challenge. And if I know the genetics within that breed, and I know they're high marbling genetics, then I can, with greater accuracy, estimate, well, what is going to be that quality grade of that animal and provide a better estimate as well. So those are, things that you got to keep in mind. Unfortunately, the 5 steers that we're going to look at, we can guesstimate what breed type they are. You will be able to, but we don't really know what kind of genetics are behind those breed types. And so it's a little more difficult with us for that. And so we've seen in the industry, if you can, if you're selling in bigger lots and provide feedlots or others that are buying your cattle with some more background information, there's certainly more value in those cattle as well. And even if you're only producing a handful of cattle yourself and marketing them as freezer beef, or selling shares of your cattle to be processed, then again, it's important for you to look at the genetics behind those cattle from a marbling, but also production and efficiency as well. So when we evaluate finishing on cattle, some things that you keep in mind. One is cattle will finish from the front, back, and the top down. And as cattle become fatter, they will begin to take on a more rectangular appearance. And so the voids fill in this lower round. It fills in around the tail head. And as cattle become really, really fat, and we get into that yield grade 4s and 5s, the tail will essentially disappear. We will see fat build up in that brisket as well in those animals, and into their underline and their cod and their flank as well. So you'll begin to see those animals begin to finish and really fatten as they become mature and more days on feed. Dan, I'm not watching the Q&A. Is there any questions coming in?
Yeah, I think so far we're doing good. Davey's answering those.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, I think we're doing good. Thanks.
Okay, good deal. So again, as we evaluate this particular steer and we look at him, he's put some fat on his brisket. As we look behind his shoulder and across his ribs, we don't see much fat across those ribs. He is putting a little bit of fat around his tail head there. And so again, on him, and I don't know for sure what his fat thickness actually was, and we're just going by the picture, but you would guess that he probably has somewhere in that, 1/2 inch to 6/10 of an inch of fat there with that. And so the next question is, and I'll ask this, what is his breed type, or what do you think? Oh, sorry. What do you think the breed of this animal is? And if we look at him, yep, he's black-hided. He doesn't appear to have a lot of sheath or ear or Brahmin characteristic in him. He may have some if you look at him, and he may actually, just looking at the coarseness of his joints, he could have maybe a little bit of continental breeding in him. But I think it's a fair statement to say that, you know, if you look at this particular steer, he's probably a high percentage Angus, okay? And so being a high percentage Angus animal, I'm trying to get to my text box here. Being a high percentage Angus, what do you think? How will this calf grade? He's definitely expressed his genetic ability to marble, and also plenty of days on feed. He's had the maturity level. And so, Dan, can you read through those chats and kind of what does it look like where the response is coming in? Prime, choice, select, standard?
I'm seeing low choice, first one, high choice, Steve. Choice, that's a good rough estimate. Upper two-thirds choice, low choice, mostly all in the choice grade.
You bet. That's what I would have guessed as well. Probably in that choice grade. You know, to be the safe, that would have probably been the low choice. Now, that's not to say that he could come back select, certainly, and he could be prime as well. But whenever I'm, you know, if I'm looking at this animal, and I'm also going back through those statistics too, that data that you shared with us, Dan, and I just pulled up last week's data on grading, and in Texas, 6% prime. The national in the north was 9%, 66% choice in Texas, 76% choice in the north, and 24% select, and 11% in the north. And so, you know, you look at it from a gambling perspective, okay? And so if I'm, you know, throwing out, and I wanted to guess and gamble what grade it is, you know, I'm probably going to play the safe bet. And I know in Texas, on average, cattle are going to be somewhere around that 65% choice. 6% to 9% on the upper end will be prime. And so I appreciate everybody. We really didn't get any gamblers out there, Dr. Hale. They all were in that choice range, which was kind of the safe bet when we're guessing these. And I think when we go through the exercise, we think the same thing. All right, let's see. So the next steer, fatter or leaner than the previous steer? A little different angle. Text that in and let me know.
Fatter.
Yeah, I think the consensus is he is definitely fatter, and he's definitely done. That's for sure. And then, you know, the next question is, you know, how much fat does he have? You know, again, we're looking at a picture, but that steer is probably as fat as he is, and we're looking at his brisket. We're looking at down his top line and around his tail head, and really his shoulder just seamlessly blends into his rib cage and the rest of his body, indicating a lot of fat. This calf could be anywhere from 8/10 to a whole inch of fat there. So he's definitely fatter than the previous one. And then the next question is, and I think it's a pretty easy question, is, you know, what breed is he? And looking at him, you can see that he is Angus. And so again, I think we go back to what we're trying to ask ourselves: what grade is he going to be from a quality grade? And he's definitely fat enough. He's been on day feed plenty long. He's high percentage Angus. You know, if you want to gamble a little bit, you could say he's in that upper choice. And he may. Somebody just typed in prime. You know, just looking at the breed type and the amount of fat, looks like he's been on feed a long time, it's possible he could fall into that prime category. But again, you always have to remember that chart that Dr. Hale showed, that plateau as they begin to fatten, and we got to remember what is the genetics within that Angus steer there, and does he have the propensity to grade? So good choice, good response there. I appreciate y'all responding to that. Then we get into our yield grades, okay? Dr. Hale covered this exceptionally well when we talked about the grading, but the one thing that I want to show you is this particular diagram, and it shows that as cattle, as we look at the 4 factors that affect yield grades. One is fat, external fat. So as animals, we go from less fat, 1/10 of an inch, to 1 inch of fat or greater. You can see that drives the yield grade up numerically. As we go from lighter muscle to heavier muscle, we tend to drive the yield grade down numerically or improve it. As we go from a lighter carcass to a heavier carcass, we drive the yield grade up numerically. And as we increase the internal fat, we would also expect the yield grade to be driven up numerically as well. Now, the one thing I want to bring your attention to is that if you, as an animal increases his weight, body weight, and that could be live weight or carcass weight, we would expect, Dan, can you see that PowerPoint there?
Yeah, sure can.
All right. As an animal gets heavier in weight and its carcass weight goes up, we would expect also its ribeye area to go up as well. And so the one thing that you'll notice in these 2 factors here in the middle, so heavier carcasses, we would expect them to have bigger ribeyes. And so you'll notice that carcass weight and ribeye area kind of work against one another. And so in reality, as you look at these 4 criteria here, fat thickness is really going to have a big bearing on that yield grade there. And so that's something important to think about and to remember as we're grading those cattle as well. Fat's going to play, a pretty important factor in that. We've already gone through kind of the criteria on the yield grades. So I'm going to kind of fast forward a little bit. Areas to evaluate finish in these cattle. We've already talked about that. It's the same as if we were evaluating the amount of fat to try to estimate quality grade as well. Muscling, when we evaluate muscling in cattle, we're looking at, from a yield grade, we're looking at ribeye area. But on the live animal, we're trying to look at some indicators of that. And we're looking at how much width these cattle have, how much muscling they have in their round, how much muscling they have in their lower quarter. And we know that cattle that are heavier muscled tend to be wider based. And this particular Charolais cross steer that we have here, if you'll study him, he's very wide from the ground up. And as a feeder steer, he would have been, or a calf, weaned calf, we would have still seen this similar conformation. Cattle, young cattle that are heavier muscled are typically wider at the base. You'll also notice a heavier muscled animal is going to have more shape and expression in that hind quarter. And then as we look down their top, you'll notice whenever this animal is ribbed, like we saw Dr. Hale show, we're looking at that ribeye is right here. And so we're looking at how wide it is across its top, but then also the shape to that animal as well. And so here's 2 different steers of different degrees of muscle. It's pretty obvious the steer on the right is the heavier muscled. You can see he's wider based. He's very square from behind. The steer on the left kind of has that V appearance to him. And so he's lighter muscled in his lower quarter. If we look at each of them down their tops, you can see the gray steer is certainly wide in his top. You would expect to have a more full, round appearance in its ribeye. And then the Hereford marked steer here, you could see he's very light muscle and pretty angular out through his top as well. So definitely some differences in the amount of muscling. On the steer on the right, certainly be kind of on a above average muscled steer. The one on the left would be average to a little below average on a muscling finished market steer. Okay, so let's look at these yield grades here. And we've already seen some of these pictures of animals, but I want to show you just to get your eye right on, as we look at the steers coming up, I want you to compare those steers to the pictures we see here, but also to that grading card that I sent that link of as well, and Dr. Hale showed you. Think about those animals. And so, as you can see, this first steer is very trim in its design. This is American cross steer. Not a lot of fat in his brisket area. Very trim behind his shoulders. And you look around his tail head, there's not any cold fat there as well. But this is a steer that's also very heavy muscled as well. And so he'd be a yield grade 1. And again, imagine those pictures that Dr. Hale showed you earlier tonight. Okay, our next one, steer that's maybe not quite as heavy muscled as the previous, but also is putting on a little more fat, a little more in his brisket, a little bit more behind his shoulder and around his tail head. Here's a yield grade 3, definitely. Again, imagine that rectangle. So if we cut this steer's head off and his feet off, legs off, he's really starting to take that rectangular appearance, just like this American steer, American cross steer, Brahman cross. Here's a yield grade 4. Again, the tail head, you're beginning to lose that excess fat behind its shoulder and its brisket. And then a yield grade 5 steer, very fat, can't see its tail head anymore. And if you look at the diagram here, you can see really cut its legs off and head off, and he looks like a little rectangular box there. So Dr. Hale, that's all I've got. If there's some questions, we can answer those, and then we can move into our videos as we kind of wrap up the evening.
Yeah, hopefully people saw the date of the next year's short course there, right?
Absolutely. We invite y'all out. We certainly hope, we just wrapped up a virtual, and we certainly hope we can get back to live so we can see all of our friends in Aggie land here next year. All right.
I'm about to share the screen, and we're going to do some evaluations. Trying to do something to help optimize something. So we'll see. Hold on. Let's see. Am I sharing my screen now?
Yes, you are, Dan.
See
and I just posted the link to those yield and quality grade guide. I posted it again. So if in the chat box, if y'all want to click on that, it'll pull it up at the website, and you can kind of use that as your guide when you're evaluating the videos Dr. Hale's going to show you.
You bet. All right. So hopefully y'all can see this slide. I'll put it up on.
Power on. Bluetooth.
So everybody see that, Jason?
Yep, we got it.
QR code. All right. So if you, I'm not sure what to do if it doesn't work for you, but as you take a look at this, if you'll turn the camera on a smartphone and hold it over this QR code, you'll get a link on your smartphone to an app. It's a Qualtrics that will take you to an evaluation form.
And it's working, Dan.
Yep. So if you hold it over there, it'll ask you, do you want to go there? And you click on that, and it'll take you to a form. You type in your name, type in your email, whether you're an adult, and then just kind of walk through this and do the evaluation. Now, we're going to go through the video tonight here live, but I sent you a link to that. Let's just go back for a second. Yep, sent you a link to that, to the video that you're about to see. And if you go to that link, or if you even just type in again, Aggie virtual, virtual Aggie beef 706, it will come up and you'll see the video just through that. But there's the link, and you'll end up going there. You have to 1 o'clock tomorrow to enter your results, okay? And only do one time per person, okay? So enter what you think each one of these cattle is going to look at. So we're going to start off with steer number 1, and what your options are as you go through there. And so you might write them down on a piece of paper and go back and redo this, is whether quality grade. These are the only 5 options you're going to have on that list. Is it prime, top choice, low choice, select, or standard? And then on the same steer, what's the yield grade? Is the yield grade 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? All right, so by 1 o'clock tomorrow, you'll need to go online and enter that Qualtrics. But here's steer number 1. This steer, as you look at it, on feed over 250 days. If you look 1,290 pounds, that's the live pay weight for that calf. Okay, so this is steer number 1. And you'll see about a minute and a half of that particular steer.
And Dan, just to maybe reiterate, they will be able to see the videos after tonight on that particular link.
Yeah, they'll be on that for the duration of the program for the next 3 nights at least, maybe longer. They'll only be able to fill in that Qualtrics form until 1 o'clock tomorrow. The videos will stay up there though.
Yeah, one of the questions, Dan, is while we're watching that, Angela asked if maybe they could get the QR code through the emails that you have through the Zoom. Would that be possible?
Yeah, we can send a QR code. Yep, that'd be a good idea. We'll send a QR code.
And then another comment was that, the cattle, are a little warm. We did these late in the evening a couple of weeks ago, but just like we are, the heat and humidity in College Station, Texas was pretty high that evening. So
yeah, in Texas, they of course, these cattle, again, we're out of Grant Land and Cattle Company, and appreciate them supplying these for us and going in and hand selecting these for us. So let's take a look. That was steer number 1. Now let's look at steer number 2. Both steer 1 and 2 came out of the same pen of cattle.
yeah, and just as you're, looking at the cattle, just remember, yield grade and quality grade are 2 different measurements we're evaluating on these cattle. And when you're evaluating that quality grade, think about, okay, what is the breed type of the animal we're looking at? Think about the averages, and then think about the condition of those cattle as far as the amount of fat cover they had. Dan, you may remind us, how long were they on feed? You know that exactly?
Yeah, I do. Let me go back to the page. Yeah, so the two black steers were on feed 211 days.
They were on feed a while.
And when we come to the red steer, which is next, steer number 3, that steer was on feed. Well, it is background, but 276 days total.
So that could have included, because of where they came from, they could have been on grass for a period of time, because I know they have some big grass traps and stuff like that. So
Yeah, grass plus a growing ration.
Yep.
And
they-
so likely, I mean, they're probably on feed at least 180 days as far as in the field, both of them.
plenty of time to grade if they are.
All right, that was steer 3. Now steer 4. Now this is a Holstein. This Holstein is on feed 354 days. The steer came in with a group that weighed about 300 pounds. Ended up being, this steer there was one of the heavier ones in that group. So they guess probably weighed about 425 coming in from the calf ranch. It's a day-old calf, of course, it goes in the calf ranch. And this steer was implanted, was also fed Optiflex.
One thing, Dan, I think it's a good point to mention here, and this is, I want everybody to kind of look at this steer and look at him through his head and other features, and what does he look like through his head and neck? If anybody wants to chat that in. Then maybe also look between his legs there. Yeah, he's definitely bullheaded, and when we first started video on him, that was the first thing that popped in my mind when we walked up to him, is that, you know, he looks like he was maybe cut late, castrated late, or a testicle left in, and as you can see, if you look closely between his legs, that he did have, when we processed him, he had one testicle left in, and that's probably some of the things, as you look at him and look at this particular bull steer / steer from a Holstein perspective, he's got a decent amount of muscling for a Holstein steer, and some of that was probably some of the testosterone effect that he's seeing there. So that's two things to go through your mind. But also something to think about too is just from a message from a producer perspective, we got to be real careful. One, we recommend we need to castrate these at an early age, but then also on those, make sure we count to 2, and if we're banding, we get 2 below the band, 2 testicles, and if we're knife cutting, we remove both of them, because we can get into some situations, and you'll see in the carcass some differences in these.
Yeah, that's right. So now we're moving over to an Angus Holstein cross, which is becoming fairly popular within the dairy industry. And this animal weighs 1,203 pounds. This animal was on feed close to 200 days also. So I'll let you take a look and guess the quality grade, yield grade. All right, so that was number 5. So again, take a look at it. These are the 5 animals that we want you to put a quality grade and yield grade. And again, the video is at that location. And I'm going to try to figure a way to actually put the QR code by the video if we can work that in there. So I'll try to work that. I was hoping that I could put it in the chat box, and so I may try that here in a minute too.
And there was a question, do you have the days on feed on the finish and ration? You know, these cattle were probably, with the days they were in the feed yard, probably over 150 days would be a good guess.
The Holstein was on feed through their feeding system of 350 days. But the dairy on beef probably only about 180 days or so actually on feed.
And then the beef steers, full beef from South Texas.
Well over 180 days. They were the first group about 250 days. I need to just ask Maurice basically whether that's part growing and then finishing off, but at least 200, 100, at least close to 200 days in the feed yard.
Yeah, so they were on full feed, plenty of time.
Let me just see if I can drop in the chat the QR code. It looks like it's going to let me. Okay, we're going to go back. So hopefully you got that information. Take a look at it. What I want to do now is talk about grid marketing. And so to do that, I also want to thank the Beef Council for, they actually originally purchased the calves and got them shipped up here, and working with Graham Land and Cattle Company. Appreciate their help in doing that. And do you see the grid marketing now, Jason?
Yeah, we're good, Dan.
Okay.
You may do a full screen.
There we go. All right. So now this is just a kind of, as we take a look at it, you know, a mock grid. You know, there's no company that has a grid that looks just like this, but it teaches the principles that we want to teach in how we sell cattle on a live basis versus selling them on a carcass basis. And you'll hear about formula feeding, you'll hear about grade and yield, and this is what you might call a carcass grid. And all of them have some elements of paying for cattle based off of how the carcasses ended up as they go harvested in the packing plants. So if they sold on a live basis, okay, they're sold on a live weight, of course, and they're given one price for the pen of cattle. And if you think about 96 cents, if you look up there, you'll see with my cursor, live cash price, $96. That's per 100 pounds. And so that's this animal. You know, if you take a look at the weights, live weights, divided by 100 times 96, and that's, you know, that's the total price. And the price of that particular animal would have been $1,296. So just kind of leading you through the grid. Over here is what the carcass equivalent, or the live price, what the live price is. Okay, so, but if I sell it instead of on a live price, if I sell it on a carcass basis, well, what's the quality of that carcass? And we're going to go through a lot of these other terms that, but you do notice the term prime, and you probably heard of CAB and top choice and select and standard and yield grade 1 through 5. And hard bone are those cattle that are older than what they would normally be coming out of a feed yard. Those would be a C, D, and E maturity animal. Those are over 30 months. Dark cutters, which again, we'll show you here in a minute. And then those are heavy in weight. And so instead of selling them on just a live basis, we take the hide off, we rib them, we look at them, and we pay you off of the actual carcass merits of that particular animal. So that's what a grid marketing would look like. Dressing percent, of course, is still important. So here's an example. Again, remember the average of panhandle is 64.5%. Well, if I sell a 1,300 pound animal at 64.5%, it's going to produce an 838 pound carcass. 1% less, okay, is going to produce, okay, 825 pound carcass. 2%, 786. That's about $20.41 difference if that animal was just the par carcass price, just the average carcass price that was given. At $1.57 per 100 weights, you take that and multiply it and compare the difference. So 1% dressing percent difference is in total value is about a $20 difference. Just so carcass weight is important when you're looking at selling cattle on a grid. So when you look at it, we talked about yield grade. That's important in selling on a grid. Talked about, quality grade. That last picture was quality grade. This is yield grade. And so now as you continue to look, talk about the factors, we talk about some of the odd things that we might see in a carcass. This is the dark cutting picture. So here's one that's fairly normal in color, and you'll see the one next to it is dark, very dark. Why do we call it a dark cutter? Because I ribbed the carcass, I cut into that 12th rib, and guess what? The meat was dark. So they call that a dark cutter. Another kind of industry term that you might hear, or probably more scientific, is dark, firm, and dry. Has a dry appearance. And all that is it's a reaction to stress before the animal is harvested. You can imagine a retailer probably doesn't really want this. They're not going to sell that as easily as they could sell a really pretty colored meat. And so what causes that? Well, it's a pH change, and really it's a change in what we call muscle sugar or glycogen in the muscle that's due to stress, long-term stress. So we're talking about not stress of just in even a couple-hour ride to the packer. We're talking about stress of animals fighting each other, or animals being hauled long distances at very hot degrees or cold temperatures. You know, it was hot today and it's really cold tomorrow, and that animal's shivering, and it uses up its muscle sugar. And as a result, it has a different pH. A pH is is a measure of acidity. And so you'll kind of see the normal living animal is about a 7 if you look at this chart. So we're looking at the pH down the side of the muscle, and we're looking at the time after slaughter across the bottom. And you notice that in a normal animal, the pH goes from a normal temperature, and the glycogen or muscle sugar turns to lactic acid over time, and it gets down to about a 5.6. That's normal. In an animal that has been undergone long-term stress, it's used a lot of that glycogen, and its pH ends up higher, and as a result, it holds on to water differently. And because of that, that animal has a darker colored meat, so they call that a dark cutter. Another term that we use for cattle that are standard or advanced maturity is no roll, and that's because in the old days, this grader would stamp the carcass, and the person behind him would look at that grade. You can see he's looking at what the grade the grader puts on it, and in that person's hand is a roller, and he would roll that carcass with the grade all the way around that carcass. Now there's very few plants that do that at all, so the term doesn't really fit anymore. But no roll in reality is ungraded beef. It's inspected for safety and wholesomeness, but this grader would not actually grade it, because a grader can tell, the packer can tell the grader, I only want you to mark those cattle that are select, choice, or prime, and yield grade 1, 2, 3, or 4. And so if it's not one of those, then they won't mark it, and that won't be rolled or won't be graded. And so no roll traditionally now is ungraded beef. And so like that one that we called standard, that would be a no roll carcass. Some other things to think about in grid marketing is thinking about the carcass. Okay, and as you look at the carcass, you're looking at bruising. So if I have a bruise and it's trimmed off on the harvest floor, that's a reduction in carcass weight. So handling those animals is extremely important, because they're going to trim that off on the harvest floor, because USDA inspectors, Food Safety Inspection Service for safety and wholesomeness, will demand it, and they will weigh the carcass after harvest, and you will be docked for that weight loss. So we talked about standard, heavy cattle, lightweight cattle. Here's one that talks about over 30 months, and that's something that you'll see on a grid sometimes. And so as you look at a picture, the set of pictures here, the first one at the very top is a set of cattle with all of its temporary incisors. So it's all the temporary baby teeth. And so this animal's generally on average about 18 months or younger. At about 18 months, the first set of permanent incisors break the gum line, and you see these big teeth coming in just like kids. If that second pair have fallen out and the permanents have come in, if one of those teeth has broken through the gum line, that animal is deemed to be over 30 months of age, and you could get a discount for that if you're selling that those cattle out of that feed yard. What about Angus cattle? So this is something that is asked in every group. You know, what makes an Angus animal? Well, there's a couple ways to be Angus as far as identifying. One way is by the way the animal looks. And so USDA has come up with a system to determine if that animal is of Angus heritage. It doesn't mean it's certified Angus beef. It just means that it is approved for being called an Angus heritage animal. And what basically it looks at, okay, is the animal black? Or if it isn't, does it have weird color markings? So each steer, heifer, if you read through here, must have a predominantly black hide with no other color behind the shoulder, above the flank, breaking the midline, and excluding the tail. And so as you look at looking at an animal, determining Angus heritage, you can look at these animals. The first two definitely fit that bill. If we look at the second one, it probably has Angus, but it's not predominantly black, and so it wouldn't fit it phenotypically. And then you see this one that's probably a Senetal cross, and you see the white on the back, and so that's definitely an out. And so as you look at it, just kind of talking through, Holsteins would be eliminated from this. And that's the main thing, is if it's a Holstein, that's another reason that they use that verbiage, is because a lot of those will have white and kind of some odd areas. So just because it's Angus doesn't mean it's certified Angus beef, or there are actually 165 USDA certified beef programs now. 123 of those in 2014 were called Angus. Not just certified Angus beef just happened to be the first one to do that in 1978. They came up with their branded beef program way before everybody else. And so here we have Alpo dog food, and you'll notice in the little corner it says made with Angus beef, and you'll see these are great hamburgers and great hot dogs, both made with Angus, but not necessarily, they're not CAB, okay? They're generally probably from a lean source, from an animal that was predominantly black-hided and didn't have weird white markings. And then also the fat source came from that, and they blended those two together to come up with these hamburgers and hot dogs. And not even necessarily from feed yard steers. Could have been from a market cow or market bull. So to be certified Angus beef, and there are also several other programs that the major packers have that mirror this, and where you have to, it's an Angus program that they have, but these are the other 10 criteria. And probably the biggest one to note is that modest or higher amount of marbling, which makes that animal top choice. But notice there's also a ribeye. There's also a weight criteria. There's also a fat thickness opposite the 12th rib. Isn't it wonderful that you guys know all those terms? A maturity, superior muscling, no neck hump. Okay, that's to keep the predominantly Brahman cattle out, and no blood splash. That's what capillary rupture is, and no dark cutters. So you guys know all these terms now as we go through. And so we're going to end up pricing these cattle on this grid tomorrow. And we'll show you that information. We're going to show you the carcass data and the grid value of each one of the 5 steers when we take a look at that and we look at the data. So, hey, I think we're done on time. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will work on trying to send you all I'm going to go ahead and put up the QR code just so you can get that one more time. We're going to try to get that sent to you as well. Any questions as I'm doing that, Jason?
Yeah, I had one that one or two people wrote in. What percent what's the dark cutter incidence kind of on average in the U.S.?
It really depends on the time of year. So as you look at it, you're going to find those quite most often in October and in February, where we have significant weather changes. Cattle can equilibrate pretty easily to cold weather. They have a harder time actually with hot weather a lot of times. And so as you look at that, you know, it's something to, let me get rid of this, trying to get that QR code up. And it is, so you're looking at generally what 2 to 3% of the cattle would fit into that category of being a dark cutter, and sometimes it might get a little higher, lower, at particularly significant weather events that we might have.
So it's still pretty low, and just also to remember the from through the beef quality audits and other things, we've identified everything from management at the feed yard to hauling practices, trucking, as well as unloading, moving them through until we knock those cattle. Things to minimize stress on them one, for the welfare of the animals, but then two, we also have to look at, reducing that stress on them from an incidence of dark cutters and so on. So.
Yeah. And, so animals' disposition could impact that also, or mixing cattle from different pens and putting them together where they're going to fight each other. That's another factor. A lot of times it's additive, where weather changes is probably the biggest reason, but maybe there's that animal's already been stressed in some fashion. It seems like there are animals that are more resistant to that stress and some that are more susceptible to that stress.
Dan, when will you make these recordings available? That was one of the questions somebody asked.
It'll take us a day or two, and we will put them in a spot where you can go back and take a look at them for about 2 weeks, and then we'll end up pulling them back down. And we will send you those links, because we'll only send the people that are registered those links. So we will send those to you again via email. So I'm not sure who's doing that, but I don't know how to get it off. But that's for sure. Let's try to undo. Yep. Something that we need to work on.
Yep, that kind of messes our QR. Oh, there's a QR code. There we go.
All right. Anything else?
I think we're good for the evening. We had a great crowd. We look forward to hosting you guys tomorrow evening and the next evening as well. Great questions too. We appreciate that.
Yeah, tomorrow evening, Dr. Davey Griffin will be the primary person talking about. Now we're going to go and we're going to talk a little bit and show you the results of the cattle, but he's going to take you through fabrication of those cattle into box beef cuts and talk about the value of all 5 steers based off of how they cut out. So Dr. Griffin actually had a team of people, and they fabricated these to ribeye steaks and bone and fat and tenderloins, and he'll tell you all about the carcasses from that and give you a true packer value of each one of those 5 steers. So again, thank you for being here tonight, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow night at 6:30.